At the beginning of 2025, despite stable tensions, the situation in the Middle East did not cause panic. The U.S., Israel, and the Persian Gulf countries continued to closely monitor Iran's actions, but did not record a sharp increase in its military capabilities. Iran's missile program had long been a cause for concern, but its potential was considered limited, mainly due to its reliance on outdated ballistic systems and logistical challenges. Discussions in the international arena focused mainly on Iran's nuclear program rather than high-tech weapons. Even Israeli threat assessments emphasized nuclear facilities in Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. Israel's missile defense, including the Iron Dome and David's Sling systems, was considered effective enough to neutralize any threat from Iran, at least until recently. However, in the summer of 2025, alarm bells began to ring. Western intelligence reports indicated that Iran was completing tests of a new missile capable of overcoming existing missile defense systems. This weapon was first mentioned unofficially in classified reports from the Pentagon and NATO intelligence agencies. But it soon became clear that this was not just an improved ballistic missile. This was a whole new level of threat. Information came in bits and pieces. Leaks indicated that the missile was called Qassem Basir, a new medium-range missile with optical guidance and launch capability from mobile platforms. Later, there were also mentions of the Fateh 1, a hypersonic missile that Tehran was touting as a technological breakthrough. Despite Western experts' skepticism about its hypersonic characteristics, fears began to grow. By that point, the U.S. was already involved in a covert phase of the conflict. In June, it launched strikes on key Iranian nuclear facilities. Washington hoped that Operation Midnight Hammer would delay the development of Iran's nuclear program. But instead of weakening Iran, it led to an unexpected technological breakthrough. Iran not only preserved its infrastructure, but, as it later turned out, stepped up the development of new weapons in response. While officials in the U.S. and Israel were betting on sanctions and targeted strikes, Iran continued to operate in the shadows. The development of new missile systems was carried out in complete secrecy. According to Western intelligence, the testing site was a mountainous area near Qom and facilities in the east of the country, where some of the research personnel and equipment had previously been transferred from Isfahan. By mid-2025, U.S. intelligence reports increasingly mentioned terms previously unused in relation to Iranian weapons: optical guidance, autonomous target selection, and low launch signature. This suggested that Tehran was no longer relying solely on quantitative superiority or proxy terrorism, but was instead betting on technology. Of particular concern was the fact that the new missile could be launched from a mobile platform disguised as a regular truck. This meant that the missile could be deployed anywhere in the country or even beyond its borders, including Iraq or Syria, where Iran has a wide network of allies. An additional risk factor was that, according to Iranian sources, these missiles do not require GPS guidance. They allegedly use optical target detection and can hit a target even under electronic warfare conditions. At the same time, their accuracy is estimated to be within a meter, which for medium-range missiles, especially given Iran's history, was a real technological shock. Israeli analysts began urgently revising their defense scenarios. The Iron Dome and other missile defense systems were not originally designed for hypersonic or maneuvering targets moving along unpredictable trajectories. Moreover, the long range and autonomy of the new missiles made them difficult to intercept in the early phase of flight. This technological leap caught Israel and the U.S. off guard. Suddenly, Iran ceased to be a regional irritant and became a potential player with the ability to deliver high-precision strikes against key infrastructure targets, including deep inside Israeli territory. It was at this moment that the normal world, with its stable tensions and predictable threats, began to crack at the seams. The news of the existence of Iran's new generation of missiles initially caused confusion in international circles, followed by an urgent response. The U.S. intelligence services were the first to sound the alarm. The Pentagon began an urgent assessment of the consequences. The new system could threaten U.S. bases in the region, such as Al Udeid in Qatar and Ain al-Assad in Iraq. Calculations showed that even with a standard trajectory, Qasem-Basir missiles could reach these targets in a matter of minutes. U.S. intelligence began collecting satellite data to track possible deployment sites for these missiles. The focus was on mobile launchers that could be disguised as trucks moving through the province of Lorestan and the outskirts of Tehran. However, the Iranians acted competently. Mobile groups appeared for a few hours and then disappeared, leaving minimal traces. In Israel, the situation was perceived even more dramatically. The IDF leadership began to review its entire operational strategy. The General Staff acknowledged that the Iron Dome and even the David Sling system could not guarantee protection against precision strikes on critical infrastructure. Of particular concern were potential attacks on the Dimona nuclear facility and the Hatzarim air base, which had previously been considered secure. At the same time, the Israeli political establishment began discussing the possibility of a preemptive strike against Iranian scientific and military facilities. According to some military experts, such a move could be the only way to neutralize the threat before it turned into a real disaster. However, this scenario meant open confrontation. This would entail the risk of not only a regional conflict, but also the involvement of the U.S., NATO countries, and Arab states in the war. Washington feared that such a strike by Israel could derail diplomatic efforts to keep Iran in check and trigger a wave of instability from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea. The situation called for immediate decisions. Possible scenarios were discussed behind the scenes at the U.S. National Security Council, ranging from cyber attacks on Iranian infrastructure to a direct military strike on facilities where Qasem-Basir and Fatah 1 missiles could be developed. However, each of these options carried enormous risks. A cyber attack could have failed to achieve its goal or provoked a large-scale response, including strikes against U.S. allies. And the direct use of force meant the start of a new war with unpredictable consequences. Meanwhile, the Iranian side showed no signs of backing down. Moreover, officials began to comment on the situation with strategic confidence. Tehran declared that the new generation of missiles were the shield and sword of the Iranian people, and that any aggression would be met with an immediate response. The statements were accompanied by the publication of videos of launches, mock-ups of warheads, and demonstrations of transport vehicles. This rhetoric played on two fronts at once. Domestically, it strengthened support for the government and mobilized public opinion. Abroad, it created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. The international community, including the UN and the EU, began to call on the parties to exercise restraint, but the real levers of influence remained minimal. This tense phase culminated in a closed meeting of the UN Security Council, where the United States presented intelligence indicating the existence of active mobile missile launch platforms on Iranian territory. However, the permanent members of the Security Council, Russia and China, blocked a tough resolution, demanding a non-politicized approach and respect for the sovereignty of the Islamic Republic. Against the backdrop of diplomatic deadlock, Israel made a decision. It could not wait any longer. According to media reports, orders were given to prepare Operation Line of Fire, a massive strike on sites where new weapons were being stored and manufactured. It was at this point that the confrontation entered a new phase, where every mistake could have irreversible consequences. On the night of July 18th to 19th, 2025, Israeli aircraft took to the skies. Squadrons of strike aircraft equipped with high-precision bombs and electronic warfare systems lined up over the Mediterranean Sea. Everything pointed to Israel preparing a preemptive strike. Operation Line of Fire had moved from the planning stage to the implementation phase. The targets were three key sites in Iran: the suspected Qasem-Basir Missile Production Center in Isfahan, a field test site near Yazd, and a transport hub through which, according to Israeli intelligence, mobile launchers were being transferred. According to Israeli sources, the strikes were carried out in a very short time, using low-profile platforms and satellite navigation. Iran's response was immediate. Just 2 hours after the first strikes, air raid sirens sounded in Haifa, Ashdod, Tel Aviv, and Beersheba. Iran began launching medium-range missiles, most likely the same ones that were considered experimental just yesterday. Some of them were intercepted by Israeli missile defense systems, but at least 3 missiles reached their targets. One of the strikes hit a power plant in the south of the country. Another hit an IDF ammunition depot, and the third hit a civilian industrial facility. It was the moment of truth. The world saw that Iran's new weapons are not a myth. They exist, they work, and most dangerously, they can overcome defenses. Israel was under direct attack. Media outlets around the world began emergency broadcasts. Western diplomats rushed to contact Tehran and Tel Aviv, trying to secure at least a 48-hour ceasefire. At this stage, it became clear that the situation was out of control. The conflict took on a dynamic that was uncharacteristic of previous outbreaks. It was no longer a restrained exchange of blows. Now it was something more. It was a demonstration that Iran was capable of striking and surviving retaliatory attacks. And Israel could no longer feel completely safe, even with U.S. support. The scale of events and the speed with which they unfolded stunned even the most experienced analysts. What had been considered a contained conflict for many years turned into a full-scale technological duel. For the first time in many years, Israel faced a threat that undermined its military superiority. The familiar scenario, in which the IDF operates with impunity in the air, was suddenly called into question. In response to the Iranian launches, Israel deployed not only its air force, but also its cyber units. According to information leaked to the press, a large-scale cyber attack was carried out on the energy grid in western Iran. In Tehran, power outages were reported for several hours, and alarms at military facilities went off chaotically. But even this attempt to throw Iran off balance did not bring the desired result. The Iranian side not only withstood the blow, it began to use its entire arsenal of asymmetric weapons against the enemy. Proxy groups in Iraq and Lebanon became more active, and strikes began on facilities linked to Israel's logistics and supply chains. Unmanned boats were spotted in the Red Sea which, according to some sources, were remotely controlled and carrying explosives aimed at Israeli and Allied shipping. Thus, the first turning point in this conflict was not just an escalation. It was a fundamental change in the very nature of the war. Whereas previously it had been a confrontation between states, the conflict had now taken on a networked structure. It was spreading across regions, affecting the interests of other countries, and involving a whole range of non-state actors. The West realized that Iran could no longer be viewed solely as a country under sanctions with a vulnerable economy. It had become a technologically adapted player, capable of simultaneously conducting military operations, defending its internal infrastructure, and attacking on multiple fronts. This new reality required a rethinking of approaches, both on the part of the U.S. and the entire NATO alliance. When the dust from its first strikes settled, it became possible to look deeper into the conflict, to where the causes, not the consequences, lie. A superficial glance paints a simple picture. Iran has created a new weapon, Israel has responded, and the U.S. is alarmed. But in reality, everything is much deeper and more disturbing. Iran's technological breakthrough was not accidental. It is not the result of panic following the strikes on nuclear facilities. It is the result of decades of systematic, patient, and secretive work. Under sanctions, in isolation, and without official access to Western technology, Tehran has built its own scientific and engineering ecosystem. Universities, military laboratories, and export companies serving as fronts have all worked for years toward a single goal: to make the country resistant to isolation and ready for asymmetric conflict with the West. At some point, the Iranian leadership came to a strategic conclusion. Nuclear weapons are a symbol of power, but high-precision non-nuclear weapons are a more interesting, flexible, and difficult-to-contain element. Medium-range missiles, guided warheads, drones, cyber weapons, all of these became priorities. And therein lies the main truth. Iran invested in something that is cheaper, more accessible, and more difficult to stop than a nuclear warhead on an ICBM. In addition, the new approach allowed Tehran to act flexibly. It could publicly distance itself from its proxies, use unofficial means of destruction, attack in the gray zone, and at the same time not bear immediate political responsibility. And the West, preoccupied with Ukraine, its domestic economy, and China, systematically underestimated this maneuver. That is why the blow came as a surprise to many in the US, Israel, and the EU. Officials hoped until the very last moment that Iran was simply not ready, that sanctions were working, that their intelligence had everything under control. But a new missile, a new scenario, and a new conflict have proven that the time of technological contempt is over. Iran is not North Korea. It can, wants to, and already knows how to strike hard. A significant discovery for Western analysts was not only that Iran had managed to create high-precision weapons, but also how it had integrated them into a new architecture of war. The threat became not only material, but also conceptual. Tehran has learned to use the information space as effectively as it uses missiles. Every statement, every leak, every demonstration of technology had a clearly calculated effect. The Fatah 1 and Qasem Basir missiles have become not only weapons of physical impact, but also means of psychological pressure. When Iran published video footage of the tests and simulated strikes on Tel Aviv, the international community's reaction was immediate. It was a signal. Iran is now capable of setting the rules in the media space, raising the stakes not only with explosions but also with images. The deeper truth is that the West has fallen into a trap of its own making. The focus on sanctions, containment, and isolation no longer works in a world where technology spreads faster than political norms. Engineers working in Tehran use the same math, the same algorithms, and the same methods as their colleagues in Massachusetts or Zurich. The difference in funding is no longer critical, and the motivation is much higher. Add to this another factor. Unlike the West, Iran does not need political legitimacy for its actions. It does not have to explain every decision through parliament, the press, or international institutions. This gives it flexibility, speed, and the ability to take unexpected steps. The West operates within the rules. Iran is outside them. Moreover, it is not alone. China, Russia, Venezuela, and North Korea are not just satellite states. They are potential suppliers, allies, and channels. Technological isolation has become an illusion. Iran has integrated itself into an alternative globalization where sanctions only strengthen rather than destroy. And that is what makes its new arsenal more dangerous than anything else. In this reality, Israel and the US can no longer afford to act according to old patterns. Their enemy has not just grown, it has changed the very nature of the conflict. This is the profound truth that they are only beginning to come to terms with. The consequences of July's exchange of blows turned out to be much more serious than even the most pessimistic analysts had expected. The world once again found itself on the brink of a large-scale conflict in the Middle East, but now with a new level of technological and strategic threat. Israel, following attacks on its territory, activated a state of full military readiness. Scenarios of a direct invasion of Syria or strikes against allied Iranian forces in Iraq were being drawn up behind the scenes. But in Washington, a completely different tune began to be heard. The White House understood that escalation could spiral out of control and turn into a disaster, not only regional, but global. The U.S. was already embroiled in a war in Ukraine, providing strategic containment of China in the Pacific region, and could not afford a third front involving a country with tens of thousands of missiles. An urgent diplomatic mobilization began. Representatives from Qatar, Turkey, and even Switzerland arrived in Oman as mediators. Leading world powers, including India and Brazil, issued statements on the need for an immediate political settlement. But in practice, the negotiations stalled. Tehran felt like the winner. Iranian rhetoric changed. Official statements increasingly included phrases such as, "a new stage in the defense of the Islamic world," and "the return of strategic balance." Television reports showed solemn gatherings where missile designers and engineers received state awards. This was not just mobilization. It was triumph. And in this triumph, there was a sense of menace. Iran felt stronger than ever. Israel, meanwhile, found itself in a difficult position. On the one hand, it needed to respond to the threat. On the other, it faced pressure from the U.S. and Europe, which were calling for restraint. The IDF stepped up preparations for a massive operation in Lebanon and Syria to strike Hezbollah structures and Iranian proxies, but the timing was pushed back. The main goal was no longer to expand military operations, but to strengthen defenses and adapt to the new technological reality. Against the backdrop of diplomatic attempts to stabilize the situation, public attention shifted to the long-term consequences. It became clear that even if a direct military conflict could be prevented, the world would not return to the previous status quo. The technological race in the Middle East entered a new phase. Israel urgently began to review its defense concepts. The creation of a new missile defense unit specifically designed to combat hypersonic and maneuvering missiles was announced. Negotiations with the U.S. on the supply of upgraded Arrow 4 systems have accelerated. At the same time, discussions are underway on the creation of an Israeli-American alliance to develop early warning systems capable of tracking launches in real time. The U.S., for its part, is reviewing its entire strategy for dealing with Iran. Iran no longer looked like a country that could be held back with sanctions and diplomatic pressure. Washington began to form a new analytical approach. Iran is not just a threat. It is an independent technological actor with the ability to export conflict, influence U.S. allies, and maintain internal stability. However, the reaction of other countries was most alarming. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt began active consultations with military contractors. They all understood that Iran's technological success raised the question, who is next? A covert arms race began, with each country striving to keep up. This meant one thing, a new round of instability in the region. Meanwhile, demonstrations in support of the armed forces were held in the streets of Tehran. State television broadcast interviews with engineers who participated in the creation of the Fatah 1, calling them Iran's new heroes. Against a backdrop of economic hardship and political isolation, this military victory became a symbol of national pride and political unity. And all this happened amid the deafening silence of the UN Security Council, divided, paralyzed by the right of veto and conflicting interests. The world was faced with a fact. The international institutions created to prevent global crises were failing. And new technologies and geopolitical ambitions were shaping a completely different reality. One that was more dangerous, more unstable, and perhaps closer to a major war than at any time since the beginning of the 21st century.